Imagine fighting a war where your enemy can see everything you do from space. You move a tank battalion at 3 in the morning, thinking you're hidden by darkness. Satellites photograph you. You disguise artillery positions with camouflage netting. Infrared satellites see right through it. You send radio messages using encryption you think is secure. Signals intelligence satellites intercept every word. You literally cannot hide. Every move you make, every order you give, every position you occupy, the enemy knows about it within hours. That's what Iraq faced in Desert Storm, and they had no idea it was even possible. Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about the weapon system that might have been more important than any jet or tank, satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth. Communications satellites let coalition forces coordinate operations across a theater the size of France. GPS satellites guided troops through featureless desert. Reconnaissance satellites photographed every Iraqi position. Weather satellites predicted sandstorms. Intelligence satellites intercepted Iraqi communications. This was the first space war, fought from orbit as much as from the ground. And Iraq was fighting blind while the coalition could see everything. Before Desert Storm, satellites were important but not decisive in warfare. They provided intelligence and communications but weren't integrated into combat operations the way they became in '91. The technology had advanced dramatically through the '80s. Digital imaging, real-time data transmission, better resolution, more sophisticated sensors. By 1990, the United States had the most advanced satellite reconnaissance system in the world. Iraq had essentially nothing. They relied on ground-based observation and limited aerial reconnaissance. The reconnaissance satellites were game changers. The Keyhole satellites, specifically KH-11 and KH-12, could photograph Iraqi positions with incredible resolution. We're talking about being able to see individual vehicles, identify tank types, count artillery pieces. These weren't grainy photos. These were clear, detailed images good enough for targeting. And the satellites passed over Iraq multiple times per day, updating intelligence constantly. Iraqi commanders had no idea the coalition knew exactly where every major unit was located. Process worked like this. Satellites would photograph Iraqi territory. The images would be transmitted to ground stations, analyzed by intelligence specialists, and distributed to operational commanders within hours, sometimes faster. A tank brigade moving into position in the morning could be photographed, analyzed, and have targeting coordinates generated by afternoon. The speed of this intelligence cycle was unprecedented. In previous wars, reconnaissance photos took days to reach field commanders. In Desert Storm, it was hours. Major Sarah Chen was an intelligence analyst working with satellite imagery during Desert Storm. She described the advantage as overwhelming. We'd get fresh satellite photos every day showing Iraqi positions. We could track their movements, see when they repositioned artillery, identify command posts. They couldn't hide from us. Everything they did we saw, and they had no satellites watching us, so they were operating blind. It wasn't a fair fight from an intelligence standpoint. Communications satellites enabled the entire coalition operation. Running a war with forces from 34 countries, spread across multiple countries, requires massive coordination. Phone calls, data transmission, video conferencing, all happening through satellites. Defense Satellite Communications System, or DSCS, satellites handled the military communications. Without them, the coalition couldn't have coordinated the complex air campaign or the ground offensive. General Schwarzkopf could video conference with commanders in the field, with Pentagon leadership in Washington, with coalition partners in their capitals, all in real time. Orders went from command centers to units in the field via satellite links. Battle damage assessment from pilots was transmitted via satellite immediately after missions. The information flow that made the fast-paced operation possible depended entirely on satellites working flawlessly in orbit. Weather satellites were crucial too. Desert weather can change rapidly. Sandstorms appear with little warning. Visibility conditions affect both air and ground operations. Weather satellites gave coalition forces advance warning of weather changes. They could plan airstrikes around storms, schedule ground movements when conditions were optimal, avoid flying helicopters in dangerous winds. Iraqi forces had limited weather forecasting capability. They dealt with conditions as they happened. Coalition forces planned around them. The GPS satellites we talked about in another video deserve mention again here. 24 satellites providing navigation to anyone with a receiver. This turned the featureless Iraqi desert from impassable terrain into open highway for coalition forces. The left hook maneuver, the rapid ground advance, the precision of artillery fire, all enabled by GPS satellites. Iraq had nothing comparable. Their navigation was maps and compasses. The technological gap was measured in decades. Signals intelligence satellites intercepted Iraqi communications constantly. Iraq's military communicated by radio, landline telephone, and microwave links. The signals intelligence satellites could intercept radio transmissions and microwave communications. Ground stations would intercept landline communications. The coalition knew what Iraqi commanders were saying to each other, what their plans were, where they thought coalition forces were positioned. This gave coalition planners insight into Iraqi thinking and allowed them to exploit Iraqi mistakes. There's a famous example from the air campaign. Coalition intelligence intercepted Iraqi communications showing that Iraqi air defense commanders thought coalition aircraft were avoiding certain areas. They were right. Coalition planners had deliberately avoided those areas to reinforce that belief. Then, when Iraq moved resources away from those areas, coalition aircraft flew through and struck targets with minimal resistance. That kind of deception only works when you know what the enemy thinks. Signals intelligence satellites made it possible. The infrared satellites could detect heat signatures from space. Tank engines, vehicle convoys, industrial facilities all produce heat that infrared sensors can detect from orbit. Coalition forces could track Iraqi vehicle movements at night when visual observation was impossible. They could identify active Iraqi facilities versus abandoned ones. They could verify bomb damage by checking if facilities were still producing heat signatures after strikes. This was another way Iraq couldn't hide. Iraq's lack of satellite capability put them at a crippling disadvantage. They couldn't see coalition force movements. They couldn't intercept coalition communications effectively because satellite links are much harder to intercept than ground-based communications. They couldn't accurately forecast weather. They couldn't navigate precisely. They were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tools while the coalition fought with 21st century technology. Some Iraqi commanders understood they were being watched from space and tried to adapt. They'd move units at night hoping satellites couldn't see them, not realizing infrared satellites made night movement even more visible. They'd use camouflage netting not knowing satellites could see through it with multispectral imaging. They'd limit radio communications not knowing signals intelligence satellites could intercept those too. Every adaptation they tried had already been countered by satellite technology. The psychological impact of satellite surveillance on Iraqi forces is hard to measure but probably significant. Knowing or suspecting that your enemy can see everything you do from space creates paranoia. You can't relax, can't assume any position is secure, can't plan movements without wondering if satellites are watching. That constant psychological pressure adds to the stress of combat and degrades decision-making. After Desert Storm, every military in the world recognized that space dominance was crucial. Countries that could afford it invested heavily in satellite technology. Those that couldn't sought partnerships or access to other nations' satellites. The era of fighting without space-based assets ended in 1991. No military planner would attempt a major operation today without satellite support for communications, navigation, intelligence, and weather. The commercial satellite industry exploded after Desert Storm partly because the war demonstrated what satellites could do. Companies realized there were civilian applications for the same technologies. GPS became ubiquitous in cars and phones. Satellite communications enabled global internet connectivity. Weather satellites improved forecasting for everyone. The technology developed for military purposes spilled over into civilian life, changing how billions of people live. For the troops on the ground, satellite technology was mostly invisible. They didn't see the satellites orbiting overhead. They just experienced the benefits: GPS units that told them where they were, communications that worked reliably, intelligence briefings with fresh satellite photos showing enemy positions. The technology enabled everything but stayed in the background. That's how the best technology works: invisible but essential. If you served in Desert Storm and used satellite-enabled technology, GPS, communications, intelligence, leave a comment below. The satellite story is one of those behind-the-scenes aspects that doesn't get much attention, but was absolutely fundamental to how the war was won. Thanks for watching Gulf War Chronicles. The satellites orbiting silently above the battlefield might have been more important than all the tanks and planes combined. They gave coalition forces an information advantage so overwhelming that Iraq never had a realistic chance of winning. When one side can see everything and the other side is blind, the outcome is predetermined. Desert Storm proved that future wars would be fought in space as much as on Earth. The country that controls space controls the battlefield below. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. We're telling the complete story of Desert Storm, including the space technology that made victory inevitable before the first shot was fired. I'll see you in the next one.